Good afternoon, all, and a warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining today's expert series webinar on the topic diversity and decentralization: how to build sustainable food systems. And I am Abhishek, your moderator for today. I take this opportunity to thank our chairman, sir, all our senior members of the management team, the dean, and the faculty who are present over here, the students, and the guest for today, Dr. Richa Kumar, who has taken out time to address our students. Dr. Richa Kumar is an associate professor of sociology and policy studies at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and also holds a position of associate faculty, School of Public Policy at IIT Delhi. Her research and teaching interests are in the areas of sociology of agriculture, food and nutrition, science and technology studies, and rural and agrarian policies. She has completed her PhD in history and anthropology of science, technology, and society from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. She is also the recipient of inaugural Elizabeth Adisesia Memorial Award in 2019, as well as New India Fellowship in 2010. She has authored a book, Rethinking Revolutions, Soybean Chopals and the Changing Countryside in Central India, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am, for having taken time out to join us and address the students. For the audience, you are requested to keep your mic on mute. If you have any questions, you can just type it on the chat box and we would put it before our expert speaker and she would be answering it. And in fact, we have shared also a link which you can refer to for this particular topic. Ma'am, I shared this link and it's over to you now, ma'am, for this address. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Abhishek ji. I hope you all can hear me clearly.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, audience, please keep your.
Right. Thank you so much, Abhishek ji, for inviting me here to speak today. And it's my honor and pleasure to be speaking to all of you this afternoon. And let me begin by giving you a very brief structure of my talk. I and I guess, as Abhishek ji said, my background is I'm a social scientist who studies agriculture in rural India, and that's the perspective which I will be bringing to the discussion today. This talk is also interesting because it is happening at a particular moment in time when we have these farmer protests around Delhi. I'm in Delhi at the moment, and we have farmers that have, literally held the city to siege more than 50 days now, and several rounds of talks have happened with the government. So I am also hopeful that through this talk you will also get some perspective about why is it that farmers are in really deep trouble and what might be possible ways for us to help them get through the problems that they've been facing. So quickly I'll go along with the structure of my talk. I'm going to speak to you about why are our food systems unsustainable, and also why is it that farmers have been facing problems because of this. What is the link between unsustainability and farm incomes and farm economics. I will then speak about two principles to help rethink our food system, to bring it towards sustainability. I will then share with you three policy measures that I think would help us move in this direction of sustainability, and also four different metrics or measurements that can also help us redefine how we evaluate our food systems. And I know you're all students of management and you all may be thinking of possibly startups later on, or possibly getting into research. And at several points in the talk, I will suggest ways in which, as startups or as students or researchers, you all can actually contribute, because this is an area that requires a lot of us, all of us, to get involved in thinking about change and transformation. So let me first begin by sharing with you, Abhishek ji, I'll try and share some of these slides which are about just to give you some data about the unsustainability of our current food system and the damage that it has done to our ecology. Are you able to see
Yeah, ma'am. It's
land degradation? So
yes, yes.
this is part of the link which I have shared with you, which is this link to the State of Rural and Agrarian India Report 2020, which has recently come out in the last couple of months. An organization that I am a part of, the Network of Rural and Agrarian Studies, has come up with this report, and I simply want to share with you a few pages that talk about the degradation of our environment. So this is land degradation. 38% of our total geographic area in India is degraded, and there are a variety of reasons for that degradation, which we can, talk about. The next aspect is, I mean, this gives you the next aspect is the loss of soil health. So what we have seen is huge deficiency in our soils. If you see here, this is data from the National Soil Health Card Scheme, which, if some of you may be aware, the current government had started this soil health card scheme to test soils and figure out deficiency. So you can see the percentage of deficiency in nitrogen and organic carbon and phosphorus, and various other minerals and micronutrients that have impacted the nutritional value of our foods. So not only is the soil bad, the food that we are getting out of it is also not good for our health. Next, I'd like to share with you information about the loss of seed varieties and biodiversity. And since you're all from Orissa, I'm assuming most of you, you would know that Orissa has been one of the states of our country that has been home to a huge amount of biodiversity in rice in particular. And as you can see, we had 70,000 varieties of rice, which have all, thanks to a variety of policies in the last 40, 50 years around food security, we have lost most of these varieties. Only a handful of them are actually under cultivation. In fact, you have the Rice Research Institute in Cuttack, where many of these varieties were stored at one point of time, but they are no longer in actual cultivation. I then want you guys to see this. This is a very interesting graph, and those of you who are interested in understanding more about the current situation in Punjab and why is it that farmers are agitating, this graph actually shows you, if you can, the maybe I can take this a little below here. So you can see the red is rice, the green is wheat, and then this is all oilseeds, millets, other cereals, and the top is cotton. So what you can see from 1970 onwards is when the Green Revolution policies were first brought into the country in the 1960s and 70s. There has been a complete decimation of all other millets, pulses, and oilseeds that farmers were growing. Now they're pretty much growing monocultures of rice and wheat and then some cotton. And that is one of the basic fundamental reasons for the problems that we see in farming today. So I'll share a couple of more graphs with you. This is regarding, of course, pests. You should look at these graphs related to groundwater. So this is actually telling you, this graph is showing about water scarcity. So this is the blocks in India where the red blocks are the ones where you have severe, where groundwater levels are falling significantly across the country. And if you see here, so this tells you the categorization of blocks based on groundwater quality. So not only is the quantity reducing, so we are over extracting water through our tube wells, you can see that the quality of that water is also not very good. And one of the important reasons for that is the high use of chemicals that we have in agriculture today. And finally, what I would like to share with you is this graph on climate change, because that is the largest, most looming, most critical problem facing us, and agriculture also has a significant degree to do with this problem. This graph shows you the rise in temperature, the average ambient temperature in India, the decadal change from 1901, that is about 120 years back, to 2011 to 18. And you can see we have already seen about a 0.5 degree change in temperature across India, the average temperature across India. Those of you, I'm sure most of you here are aware of global warming and climate change. The world has already warmed by 1 degree centigrade overall. India's average temperature has risen by 0.7 degrees centigrade. Climate change has vast impacts all across. And one of the biggest things that India is worried about is the impact of climate change on the monsoons. What we are already seeing is decreasing rainfall. So we are seeing less days of, the number of days with rainfall are reducing. But at the same time, increasing rainfall intensity events are increasing, which means that even though rain is falling on less number of days, it's falling much, much faster. The volume is much, much more. So, which is why we are seeing far greater events related to floods, and there is not enough time for that water to actually get soaked and recharged in the ground. And the monsoons have been critical for Indian agriculture and broadly for life on the subcontinent forever. And if the monsoons get transformed, then we will be in really, really deep trouble. And those are some of the issues related to climate change and global warming that we have to be seriously considering. So these are broadly the impacts of, this is of course about extreme, the events. This graph is quickly telling you in terms of what is the percentage decrease in farm income. So when you have extreme temperature shocks, when you have extreme rainfall shocks, what happens to farm income in this case? So this was simply to give you an idea of the kinds of impacts that we are seeing in the last several years in relation to practices and policies that have led to unsustainability. And the question before us is, are we going to continue along the same path? Because the statistics that I have shown you are very serious and disturbing statistics, especially the ones related to climate change. And in some ways, if we continue on the same path that we are today in terms of the way we are using our natural resources, our next generation is going to turn around and ask us, what is it that you guys were thinking? You consumed everything, you used up all the resources, and you've left really nothing for us at all. So it becomes our moral imperative to actually seriously consider the ways in which we are thinking about utilizing resources, and especially in agriculture. And that's what I would like to focus on for the rest of my talk today. I think I can stop the screen sharing now,
Yeah.
then I can speak to you. Right. So, what I want to begin with, as I said, is two different um, ideas, principles, as I call them, that are very important for us as we think about questions of sustainability. And the first principle is this idea of ecological embeddedness. So, when I say ecological embeddedness, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the fact that whatever we do, and I'll focus on agriculture, but this is applicable for any human activity that we do, and for humans ourselves. Whatever it is that we do in agriculture, we are working along with nature. There are activities that the natural world is performing. If you put a seed into the ground, the seed will grow on its own. We can help the seed. We can give more water. We can give fertilizers. We can even take the DNA of that seed, or breed it with other kinds of seeds, and do different kinds of things. But so far, that original seed still comes from nature. We haven't, as human beings, figured out a way to create seeds from thin air. And so we need to recognize that whatever activities we are doing, especially in agriculture, are restricted by the limits imposed by nature. And unfortunately, the current model of farming and agriculture assumes that there are no limits. And it assumes that there are no limits because this model is driven by certain measures, no, and evaluative criteria, especially the evaluative criteria that is linked to the GDP, the gross domestic product, and agricultural growth, or the idea of growth. Now, what is the idea of growth and GDP? I'm assuming most of you guys know that, but I'll illustrate it, very quickly with an example. The idea is that the more you produce and the more you consume and the more you exchange, you are adding value into the system. And when you add all of that up, it amounts to the total income of a country. And that is typically counted as, the more income you have, the better off you are, the better is your welfare. So unfortunately, when you think about the model of growth and GDP, you come out with very perverse outcomes. Now, what is an example of a perverse outcome? An example is, for instance, if a child today falls sick in the city of Delhi, then actually India's GDP goes up. Now, you will ask, how is it that if a child is falling sick, that India's GDP is going up? Well, or maybe I can just pause and ask, if some of you, I'm assuming you're MBA students, you would have some idea, right? That why would a child falling sick result in India's GDP going up? Anybody, if you can unmute and share? Nobody's being brave enough to
Uh,
unmute. And oh yes, please. Yes, who's that?
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yes,
It's Tarini Prasanna.
yes,
Ma'am, as you said that while a child fallen sick and is not feeling well, so our Indian GDP will go in an enhancement way.
yes.
So it's because of when someone is falling sick, so their parents should prefer the medical. They are going for a medical treatment, right? And for that reason, the GDP will increase
So that's
because yeah, yes, ma'am.
yeah.
They're
So that's
purchasing
absolutely
so
right.
many medical services from the hospital.
Correct. So if the parents will go and buy, typically in India, children are falling sick because of respiratory diseases in Delhi in particular, given all the pollution in the air that you guys must have heard of. And so, the parents will go and buy an inhaler or they'll buy medicines. And so the income of the medical device company or the income of the pharmaceutical company will go up. And so, of course, that will get added to our GDP. Or the parents will go to a doctor and then the doctor will pay more taxes and the doctor's income is going up. So that's getting added to our GDP. So unfortunately, we sort of have this very perverse logic that even if you are spending for negative reasons, that is all being added as a positive. And we have no way of including in this idea all of these negative externalities, as you guys are, I'm sure, aware. Negative externalities related both to human beings, but also to nature, because GDP as a concept and growth as a concept assumes that you have infinite resources that you can continue to draw upon. So, just again, as another example, in agriculture, currently agriculture relies on fertilizer inputs, chemical fertilizer inputs, and one of the inputs is phosphorus coming from rock phosphate. Now rock phosphate is a mineral that is not available in India. We import it typically from Jordan, but many few other countries in the world in South America have it, and those deposits are non-renewable. We are slowly finishing up those deposits, and they will not remain for very long. Similarly, with petroleum, all the tractors and harvesters that run on our farms, the metals and minerals required to make those tractors and harvesters in an industrial production system are coming from non-renewable sources. Similarly, the petrol and diesel that is used to run them is coming from non-renewable sources. And but we are continuing on this path of agriculture in this industrialized system and on a monoculture treadmill with complete disregard to the fact that we are actually working with nature, that the inputs coming from nature are limited, and that the output that is going back into nature, output in the form of air pollution, output in the form of toxicity of our soils and our waters, output in the form of our own health being compromised in the process, all of this is not being accounted for in the way we evaluate agriculture and in the way we evaluate ourselves in terms of our own welfare and well-being. So what is it that I propose? So the two principles that I would like you guys to think about, and I'm assuming if you have taken any course in ecological economics, you would be familiar with this. The first one is simply to recognize the embeddedness of food systems in particular, but also human activity in general in ecology within nature. And recognize that no matter what we do, we have to take into account and acknowledge the fact that um, human activity is linked intrinsically to what nature is providing us. The second is to move away from a mindset of growth and to move into a mindset of recognizing ecological limits but also inequity. Now, in this, if we move away from the concept of growth, what is the alternative that you have? Many ecological economists in the last several years have come up with this concept called degrowth. And there are three important principles associated with the concept of degrowth. The first is to reduce the size of the material economy. When you evaluate a country or you evaluate any human or economic activity along the lines of GDP and growth, we are valorizing or we are promoting production simply for the sake of adding value, and we are promoting consumption again simply for the sake of adding value to the GDP. But if you want to reduce the size of your materials economy, if you want to keep your metals and minerals in the ground, if you want to reduce the use of fossil fuels, if you want to tackle climate change, then what we need to do is use as less of materials as possible. So reducing our consumption is the first big step in this process. The second is to redistribute resources to promote ecological and social well-being. So what we see today, for example, some of you may be aware of this statistic, that if you take the top 1% of India's population, the top 1% owns the wealth and assets, owns 50% of the wealth and assets of our country. Now, if you simply take half of the wealth of the top 1% and redistribute it to everybody else, you can get rid of all the poverty and all of the other kinds of problems that actually people in our country are facing. So there are gross levels of inequality that actually structure our society, inequalities along the lines of caste, gender, class, region, a whole host of different forms of inequalities that exist. And the concept of degrowth takes that into account. The third part in the concept of degrowth is to rework our value systems and rework our value systems to promote a focus on care and well-being instead of a focus on wealth alone. So many of my students at IIT Delhi, for them, when they graduate from the 4-year degree program, the one thing that's on their minds is their financial package. So they want to know what is it, and it's reported in the newspapers also, what is the financial package of these students. So what will it take? And for many of them, they'll run after their financial packages, and then 10 years down the line, they'll realize that they have lost their health, they have lost a whole host of things in running after money. And what will it ultimately take for us to realize that care and well-being of our own health and our own well-being is more important, as well as the health and well-being of other people and our planet and our future generations, is far more important than running after wealth alone. So these three: reduce the size, redistribute resources, and rework our value systems. These are the three pillars that underlie the concept of degrowth. So those are the two important principles that I wanted to share with you, around which I think we can build a model for sustainable food systems in this country. So next, I want to then share with you three important policy shifts that will help us operationalize or translate these principles into practice. And actually, I'm really happy to be speaking to you all in Bhubaneswar today, because in fact, Orissa is one of the very few states in our country which has operationalized all of these three principles in practice. Some of you may have, I'm assuming, heard of the Orissa Millet Mission. Anybody here who is familiar with the Orissa Millet Mission and would like to share with us what, if you may have heard, what it is trying to do? Anybody? Nobody's heard of the Orissa Millet Mission here? Or maybe if you can, I mean, it would be actually interesting for me to know how many of you here today have actually heard of the Orissa Millet Mission. If you have, I'll request you to raise your hand using that raise hand button that you have in Zoom, just to get a sense. And Abhishek ji, if I can request you to let me know how many have actually raised
Sure.
their hand, if
Sure.
anybody at all.
Yes, students. So if you have read about it, anywhere heard about it from your friends, anything about your family, from your family.
Or if you have been to a millet cafe, I don't know exactly what it is called, but there are a bunch of them in Bhubaneswar, where they're selling these millet ragi mandya cookies and biscuits and other kinds of things. Nobody?
No, yeah, I guess.
Okay, all right. Well, it's good then. This is a great opportunity to share with you guys. What a wonderful thing. Oh, there is one. Aditi has raised her hand. So we have one person who has possibly been to either one of these or heard about it. But okay, let me quickly come back to my three policy suggestions, and then we'll talk a little bit about the millet mission, Odisha millet mission, and what it has done. Or maybe there are 2, 3 people who are raising their hands. All right. Um, so the first principle is that the biggest problem that we have seen in agriculture today is the fact that farmers are growing single crops. They are growing monocrops, which is typically known as monoculture. In the past, and if you all go back and speak to your grandparents, and if you have rural backgrounds, then you will certainly find out that in the past on farms, people were growing multiple crops at the same time. And so depending on the layout of your farm, if you had land which was, slightly flooding type land, you had land which was slightly higher up on an incline, depending on the soil quality, and depending on your agroecological region. So if you were, in the floodplains of Orissa, or if you were in the, the desert parts of Jaisalmer or Bikaner in Rajasthan, there would be different kinds of crops that you would be growing. And so, of course, in Orissa, it would be some form of rice. In Rajasthan, it had been some form of bajra, associated with a variety of other crops around it. So there were oil seeds and millets and pulses that were grown together in combination. What has happened in the last 40, 50 years with the Green Revolution is the disappearance of all of that diversity, and farmers have basically ended up growing one single crop in one single season. And in Punjab, it's been a terrible situation, as you saw in the graph, that it has been a rice wheat rotation. So they grow rice in Kharif and wheat in Rabi, and it's only a cereal rotation that has pretty much really, really damaged the soil and damaged a whole host of other natural resources in that region. So the first policy suggestion would be to actually dump monoculture and to move to a mixed cropping system that is suitable to the local agroecology of the region. And this would require not just scientific expertise, it would certainly require a great deal of scientific expertise coming from the disciplines of agroecology and several others. Um, but also it would require for us to take on board the local experiential knowledge of farmers themselves. So farmers, like I said, your grandparents would, if they had connections to rural areas, then they would know, they would have the knowledge. There are many of such systems that exist in Himachal Pradesh. For example, there is a Navdanya system of 9 different grains and pulses that you put together and you grow, that are supposed to work together. And the idea behind this is, how do we actually work with nature? Nature actually thrives on diversity. If you guys have read anything about biology in the past, or anything about the work of Darwin, for example, what you see is that if nature had only a single type of species or a single variety, and if that was affected by some disease or some pest or insect, then that entire variety would finish. And so nature would then finish in that sense. And so the idea of nature thriving is dependent on diversity. The more variety that nature has, the more chances of different things to survive. And if we try and do farming along that similar pattern and bring back the diversity on our farms, then we are no longer fighting with nature and having to use more and more fertilizer, more and more pesticides to try and deal with the situation. But we are actually working along with nature. Now, this sounds great, in principle, and many farmers, in fact, in the country have shifted to that and are trying to do that. But it is not simply enough for us to expect farmers to bring about this change. And this is where I think all of you become very important. And this is where I would love to see many of you putting in your resources, possibly thinking of startups and, thinking of ways to make these kinds of connections. The second important policy change is to actually help change the mindset of consumers like you and me. Now, the thing is that as consumers, we have become spoiled, and now we think that we will eat everything in every season. So in the north, for example, phool gobi, cauliflower, is a vegetable that is only eaten in winters. But people in Delhi now expect to eat cauliflower all year round. So they get their cauliflower from Shimla, or they'll get it from Bangalore or wherever else. And we have these long supply chains to supply products that are out of season, and in fact may not necessarily even be healthy for us to be eating these in the seasons when they are not originally grown. And so if now a farmer is growing multiple things, and so the Orissa Millet Mission is a great example here, that we've tried to get farmers to come back to growing millets, which are now known as nutri cereals. They're far more nutritious than rice or wheat. But you get farmers to grow millets, and the farmer has now grown the millet and brought it to the market, and the Orissa Millet Mission has even purchased it. But now it's stuck with that because people And this is not just true of Orissa, it's true of, Uttar Pradesh and, elsewhere in the country also. People think, well, millets, it's poor person's food. Millets, old people used to eat it. Who's going to eat these millets? And, they were also called coarse cereals. So there is this huge negative mindset that is associated with the consumption of many of our foods of the past. And this mindset of negativity has a lot to do with social hierarchies in our country. It also has to do with a lot of devaluation of indigenous things and items and ways of being and doing by the British. So there is a huge colonial hangover that we are also suffering from in terms of the way we evaluate and consider things. And so what is also required is a huge change in the mindset of consumers. And that is what the Orissa Millet Mission has actually been very successful in the last 3 or 4 years in doing. They started in 2017, and in the last 3 to 4 years, they've made all of these cafes in urban areas. They've also brought millets into the menus of the Anganwadis. Millets are also provided through the public distribution system. So they're buying millets on the one hand from farmers, promoting them to do mixed cropping, moving away only from monocultures of rice in particular. And they're also linking consumers to these millets. So they're changing the mindset of consumers to start appreciating the value of millets once again, the importance of millets to their health. And they're providing consumers with new recipes. They're providing consumers with an experience, a cafe type of experience where you can come and see the whole variety of things. They're even doing millet cooking classes to teach people how to cook these things at home and how you can in fact create millet soups or millet halwa, millet kheer, all kinds of different things that people are in fact learning to do. So the first and the second points in terms of the policy suggestions are actually interlinked with one another. Where if we want to change our farms, we actually have to also change our thalis. We need to change what we are eating because that will also help our farmers change what they are growing. Because if we don't ultimately consume the things that farmers are growing, farmers will not grow that stuff anymore. And so it is a relationship that we need to actually generate and have more of these across the country. So when I'm talking about students, doing startups, there's one interesting organization, and this website is called In Season Fish. And many of you might be fish eaters here. So it would be interesting for you to check out this website. So again, it's a group of researchers and students who originally started this. The idea was to educate consumers about which are the fish that are actually in season currently, and which are the and connect them with fisher folk who are then catching those particular fish, instead of a system, again, where our assumption is that we should eat and we should be able to have access to every single fish every single day of the year. Whereas again, if you speak to your grandparents, you will realize that there were points of time in the year when certain fish were not eaten at all, because that was a time for their spawning and breeding. It was a natural cycle that even our consumption cycle was linked to. And basically, we have forgotten about all that. So a very important place for you all to think about is to consider what kind of production and consumption supply chains we can create at the local level, because these supply chains will have to be created at the village level, at the block level, at the district level, possibly even at the state level, the way the Orissa Millet Mission has done. And that will require hundreds and thousands of people to come on board to think about transforming, one, the mindset of consumers, and then also supporting farmers in how to be able to do that. And that actually brings me to the third point, which I wanted to make, which is decentralization. And that's also, again, part of the title of my talk, where unless and until we decentralize policy making to the block level or to the district level, in terms of deciding what should be grown, in terms of deciding what kind of incentives is it that farmers need, in terms of deciding what kind of public investment do we need, do we need more organic matter to be made available in a particular region, do we need public investment in micro irrigation, for example, or do we need public investment in hand holding farmers to change their cropping patterns in specific ways, what kind of income support may be required for farmers. All of that has to be decentralized. There's a great deal about, one nation, one everything. But one nation, one agriculture is not possible, because agriculture works on the basis of agroecology. It works along the basis of natural variation. And you can't be doing the same thing that you will do in Rajasthan and in Orissa. It will simply not work. You have to think locally. You have to frame your products locally. You have to frame your supply chains locally. So that's the the three policy suggestions I was talking about. I now want to end by talking about four different metrics of success. So I told you that the GDP is not really the most appropriate way of evaluating our welfare, and agricultural growth is not really the way to evaluate agriculture. So what is it that we could use, in fact, in thinking about a better form of agriculture and in evaluating it differently? So the first is actually, can we move away from valuing productivity? So productivity and yield is another metric which is used to evaluate agriculture. And so far today, it's understood very narrowly in terms of grain productivity. We are not really bothered about anything else from the land except the grain that comes out of it. So what are the tons of rice that you got in an acre? How about if we evaluate not the total tons of rice, but in fact the energy throughput of that system? So, in the past, based on human labor, based on animal labor, the energy that was expended to grow something in the farm was far less compared to the calorific energy that you got out of the farm in terms of food. Now, today, given that your inputs are fertilizers and pesticides, and well, you're using tractors and harvesters to do your agriculture, all of these are products that are coming from an industrial production system. And that industrial production system is very energy intensive. So if we calculate all of the energy that is required to produce 1 unit of food, we will realize that we are actually spending a lot more energy and getting very little out at the other end. So what would it take, which is really bizarre, right? Because ideally we should be putting in less energy and getting more energy out of it at the other end, in terms of a system that is then bountiful and that is putting us in a virtuous cycle. So the first set, and all of these four things that I will tell you are very under researched. All of them will require a lot more work, a lot more analysis. And so that's where also I feel, if some of you are interested in reading more about these new indicators and thinking about how these new indicators can actually be used to evaluate agriculture, or to evaluate even industrial systems for that matter, please feel free to get in touch with me. The second indicator is looking at water intensity. How much water does it take to produce something? And unfortunately today, areas like Vidarbh in Maharashtra are growing water intensive cotton, or Marathwada in Maharashtra are growing water intensive sugarcane, or Punjab, which has, again, not that much water, is growing rice. So all of these places are growing crops that require a lot more water, and they are being grown in regions where there isn't that much water available. So understanding the water intensity of these production systems and using that as a way to think about what kind of production systems we want, especially in a country like India, where a large portion of our country is actually dry lands. The entire central India, northern Karnataka, all of that belt is in fact dry land region. And we need to be thinking about water in very different ways here. The third metric is about ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services, for those of you who are familiar with the climate change debate, is trying to understand what is it that nature is providing us in terms of value, and that in terms of sequestering carbon in the soil. So if just very quickly to explain climate change, what we have seen is, with the burning of fossil fuels, petroleum in particular, coal and oil, we have released a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which has ultimately warmed the atmosphere and then led to global warming and climate change. We need to figure out ways to get that carbon and that carbon dioxide back into the earth, back into the soil. And a great way to do that is by planting more trees, because trees take in carbon dioxide and they sequester that carbon. They take that carbon, hold on to it, and put it back into the soil. And so when farmers do farming, there are ways to do farming in which you can actually produce food, of course, and other kinds of products, but you can also sequester carbon from the air and put it back into the ground. And today, for example, our soils have very little carbon in them. Ideally we used to have 4% carbon at one point of time. Now we are at 0.04%. So we have lost all this carbon from our soils. So what would it take for us, and this is a very complicated economic issue that people haven't been able to sort out yet, but what will it take for us to evaluate and understand how farmers are putting carbon back into the soil, and how can we actually pay them for it? So there is a concept of ecosystem services that if people are trying to reduce the impact of climate change and sequester carbon, then we actually pay them for the service that they're doing to society as a whole. And how do we calculate those? That's sort of a nightmare. And how do we in fact make this happen, is something that is really worth investigating and understanding in the Indian context. The last metric that I wanted to speak to you about is actually, it's got to do with us, it's got to do with consumers. So this last metric is called food miles or product miles. And so this is a way for us to understand that the stuff that we are eating, how far it has traveled from its origin. Now, the Japanese, for example, are famous for having fished out the oceans. So they love their whale meat, for instance. And you have these Japanese fishing trawlers near the coast of Antarctica, from where they've killed all these whales and they've shipped them to Japan, and in the fish markets there, and people think of whale meat as a delicacy. Now that is an insane amount of food miles on that, and of course it's also destroyed our ocean ecosystems. But can we think of not eating the cauliflower coming all the way from Bangalore, and instead to eat the seasonal foods that are coming from our local region, to reduce the food miles? And by reducing food miles, what we are doing, we are also reducing the emissions, the carbon emissions that come from transporting that fruit from very far away to reach our plates. And so can we incorporate the idea of food miles into our consumption system? Can there be labeling on food products to tell how far they have traveled from? Can we generate awareness about the issue of food miles and help then create those local connections between producers and consumers, so that we can make more sustainable supply chains for our food? We can produce it sustainably, and we can also consume it sustainably, such that we can then mitigate climate change, mitigate the degradation of our natural resource base, and also support the needs of farmers today. So I know I'm out of time, so I'll stop here, but I'm happy to take any questions that you guys may have, either about what I have spoken today in the talk, or in terms of the farm crisis and the farm bills and whatever else you may be wanting to talk about. But thank you so much.
Yes, I think, students, we have a burning issue. That's being reported every day. We have an expert over here who can guide us a lot on this particular topic and how to view it, right? So you have diverse views coming from different people, and so it would be a real good thing to ask. So, ma'am, in fact, I would like to understand. I would like to understand about this particular whole issue of a certain section of farmers protesting against these new laws, what it is all about, and uh, the- obviously everything has different viewpoints to it. So, how do we look at this entire thing?
So thank you for asking the question. Uh, as I spoke about in my talk earlier, one of the fundamental problems that we have is the problem of monoculture. So now the farmers of Punjab, one of the biggest problems they have is that they are caught up in this monoculture of growing rice and wheat. Now, why they are caught up in that? Because we in the sense that we as consumers, we as the government, 40, 50 years back, we went to the farmers of Punjab and said, grow rice and wheat because you have to take the responsibility for the food security for this country. So pretty much a large portion of the rice and wheat that goes into the public distribution system through the Food Corporation of India is actually grown and transported from Punjab. Even if Tamil Nadu needs rice, it's coming from Punjab. That's sort of the perversity of the whole thing, but that was the original need for it. So when in the 60s, India did have a food shortage issue for some time, we basically went to the farmers of Punjab, Haryana, Western UP and said, please help us. And these are the new seeds, these are the new techniques, use fertilizer, use water, all of this package, and please do this for us. And they did it. So they actually took on the risk of monoculture, because monoculture is a very risky proposition, because like I said, you're growing one single thing. If that crop fails, everything fails. When you're growing multiple things on your farm, you have some backup. If one thing fails, something else will grow. And so that risk of monoculture was also mitigated or reduced by the government telling them that, okay, no matter what you grow, we will buy it because we need it for the public distribution system. So the farmers of Punjab and Haryana started on this system. They started growing rice and wheat. The FCI began purchasing it, and it worked fine for about 5, 8, 10 years. But then basically the FCI said, okay, now we don't need any more rice and wheat. But by this time, the farmers had now gotten hooked onto this sort of monoculture system. And in the monoculture system, what happens is, because you're fighting with nature, you are trying to grow one single thing when nature wants to do multiple things. So you have to then get rid of everything else on the farm. You have to get rid of everything else becomes weeds, everything else becomes pests. And so you need to use more and more pesticides. Now that, as some of you may know, leads you to the pesticide treadmill, because you're using a pesticide, but then pests become resistant, and then you have to use a more potent pesticide, or you have to use more of the pesticide. So, or then you're extracting water, but then your groundwater starts falling, so now you need to dig deeper and deeper tube wells. So over time, what you see is, when you're practicing monoculture farming, your costs are going up. Now, if your costs are going up, then your income or your prices have to go up accordingly. If your prices don't go up accordingly, then you are going to be, in losses. And over time, what we've seen in Punjab and Haryana is that farming has become a very bad loss-making enterprise. If the state was not providing them with the kinds of subsidies that the state has been giving them, the farmers would have stopped farming a long time back. And that, at least to some degree, it would have had an impact on our food security, on the FCI procurement of rice and wheat. Although now there are other states that are also providing that kind of rice and wheat to the Food Corporation of India. So somewhere we have to help the farmers of Punjab and Haryana to get off from this monoculture system. Now, if you look at debt statistics, for example, the farmers in Punjab are indebted to the tune of 1,20,000 rupees per agricultural household. And this is, 7-year-old data. And that is 2.5 times the amount of debt of all other households in India. So the farmers in Punjab and Haryana are really in deep crisis. Financially, they are in a crisis. Ecologically, they are in a crisis, because, the land, soils, water, air, everything is degraded. And if the government then removes any kind of state support, which is what it seems to be, the trend towards, then farming in Punjab, Haryana will collapse. And so the farmers are actually seeing an existential crisis in front of them. And which is why they're actually at the borders, and they're braving it's been horribly cold in Delhi. They've been braving the cold, and they've been sitting in those trolleys. The trolleys are lasting, some 10, 20 kilometers of long lines of trolleys are there, because these farmers know it's sort of now or never, because if they don't really figure out a way to transform things, then it's just disaster for them and for everybody else.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And there is one question from one of our students, and he's saying, what is the forecasted changes in the structure of agricultural production in future? And what is the importance of agriculture in modern economics in
So if
context of,
I have, in the context of global warming, I think,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Right. So
that's
if I have understood the question correctly, I think there are two parts to it. One is that, as we see global warming, what is going to happen to agricultural production? Um, as the first part, I think we are not quite sure, because on the one hand, people thought that, colder countries, if it's warming, then colder countries will also see temperatures rise. And if you see temperatures rise, then countries like Canada, or even Russia might be able to grow more things. Before it was too cold for them to grow a variety of things. Or in the colder parts of India, you can grow more things that you couldn't otherwise. But it's actually not very clear in terms of the feedback loops of climate change, exactly how it may impact agriculture. In India, for sure, large parts of our land um, may get more devastated because of the increasing intensity of the floods. So if our monsoon cycle gets messed up, then we can't really say what's going to happen to agricultural production. The only way that we can understand at the moment to mitigate that is to really go agroecological, to work with local agroecological regions and adjust your production patterns based on whatever local changes that we see. A one size answer for the whole country just doesn't work at all. We can't say, oh, we'll only do millets, or we'll only do wheat, or we'll only do XYZ. You have to do things according to the natural system in a given region. The second part of your question, I think, is more important. What happens to agriculture in terms of the modern economic understanding of agriculture and growth and progress and development? And I think that is a more important question in this case to answer, because typically as students of economics, many of us, I'd also studied it in the past, many of us have been told that agriculture is a residual, or agriculture is backward, and basically if you have to progress, then you have to move from an agrarian society to an industrial society. Unfortunately, what we have seen in the last 50, 60 years, not only in India, but in many other parts of the world, that transition has not happened. In fact, if you have thrown people out of agriculture, they have not been absorbed in the industrial economy at all. And partly that is because the industrial economy is already so mechanized. You don't need so many people in it anymore. And the agrarian economy is also now so mechanized, so you don't need very many people in that either. Of course, it's more energy intensive and it is more unsustainable, but you don't need people in it. So what is actually going to happen to all of those people? It's not very clear, because if we do not figure out a way to rethink livelihoods and rethink what we've been calling in the report. We deal with this question in the State of Rural and Agrarian India report 2020 in some detail. We talk about how we need to reimagine rural and agriculture as positive, meaningful kind of work, rather than thinking, today a farmer's child doesn't want to farm anymore. The idea of a farmer's son going back into farming will reduce the prospects of marriage, will reduce all kinds of other possibilities in his life. So they are also seeing that their future is in the city. But unfortunately, the future in the city is not a great future either. We've seen in the last year with COVID and the whole migrant worker trains that went back. The conditions for all of these people in the cities are horrific conditions to be in. So we need to rethink fundamentally the way we value people, the way we value work, the way we value nature, and think about ways to bring all of it together in a way that is more sustainable for the future. Some of these older theories of economics, especially Arthur Lewis's theory, they've now been highly discredited by very credible economists also. And I would urge you to look at some of those questions and debates as you guys further proceed along your own work.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And there is one more question. Obviously, I mean, chemical fertilizers are being used when there is a pressure on increasing productivity of agriculture. So, is it good or bad for consumer health? And what are, I mean, like possible ways out of it as it increases?
So, chemical fertilizers are very damaging to our soils. That's the first thing, and ultimately, if you have degraded, damaged soils, then you will have degraded, damaged food. So, what fertilizers actually do is they kill all the living microorganisms in the soil. And the living microorganisms in the soil are absolutely critical for the biological chain of nutrients to flow in the soil. It is these microorganisms that actually make nutrients in the soil bioavailable for farmers. So, for instance, this is a simple example. Then, maybe you guys may have been eating calcium, for instance. But people can eat a lot of calcium, but if they don't have enough vitamin D in their body, that calcium is not bioavailable. It will be excreted out of the system. So these microorganisms are just like that without them, it is hard for the plant to get access to all the nutrients that it needs. And all of this use of fertilizer has killed all of these microorganisms. And so the food that's coming out at the other end is also reduced in its nutrition. So if you look at food, there have been studies analyzing food from farms that have a more holistic, sustainable, integrated, soil system versus chemical intensive farming. And there is a clear difference in the nutritional content of the food that is resulting from that.
Yes, and there is a second part to it also. That question says, as the population increases, the land under agriculture or cultivation is decreasing. And second part to it, as the farmer's family grows, the land starts getting divided, subdivided, right? So, I mean, how does a farmer sustain, and what do you think about this problem of the area under cultivation getting lesser and lesser?
So this is a very interesting thing. Again, there are two parts to it. The first part I will answer in terms of the subdivision and the idea that if you have smaller size farms, then how will you grow enough food? For that, I think we simply just need to look at China. China's average farm size is much less than India's average farm size, but their production is much better than ours for a variety of reasons. Um, but the other larger question is, which is the second part of the question that's been asked, which is, if you have more and more people, how are we going to feed everybody? Now, that's a classic question that's been asked in the last 40, 50 years all the time. And that's also the question that has driven India's green revolution, that has also driven us to this chemical intensive, input intensive farming practices that have led to all of these ecological problems and health problems in our country. That question, I will like you to go back to Amartya Sen's work. I don't know how many of you are familiar with his work, which fetched him the Nobel Prize, where he talks about entitlements. So one of the important things is, when we think about more population and foods, typically there is this theory, Malthus's theory, Thomas Malthus's theory, known as Malthusian theory, which is very popular in understanding this. So it is assumed that you have, a certain amount of food, more and more people, so then, they will not have access to the food. Or similarly, you have less amount of land, and so how are you going to produce food for everybody? Now, one of the important learnings that we've had in the last 30, 40 years, and starting with Amartya Sen's work, has been that most of the times when you have a crisis of food and population, typically what you see is what is known as a famine. And Orissa has historically, especially the Kalahandi region in Orissa, has been, infamous for famines. The irony of the whole thing is that Kalahandi is a huge rice producer. And in fact, it is a rice exporter. And there are all these traders who come into Kalahandi from across the border in Chhattisgarh, who are the ones who are in fact purchasing the rice, giving the loans to the farmers there, and then transporting the rice and bringing it into the marketing system. Amartya Sen's work basically tells us that the problem of famine and hunger is actually not linked to production at all. The problem of famine and hunger is actually linked to what he calls entitlements. It is that there is in fact food available. If you go back historically and look at the famines during the British Raj, or you look at the Great Bengal famine of 1940 to 43, or you look at Kalahandi's story and you look at the statistics in terms of food production, food has always been there in sufficient quantity. What is missing is people's ability to purchase that food. They don't have enough entitlements, or they don't have enough resources or money to actually buy the food for themselves. They are under so much debt that they have to, much of that food is taken away, or under the British Raj, they had to pay so much tax that much of that food was taken away from them. And, droughts are a part of our agricultural system, dependent on the monsoon, the way we are. So droughts have been there from time immemorial. But rulers across time, historically, you can go back as far back in history as you wish to see. Rulers have always dealt with drought by opening food granaries, doing food for work, which is also what the Indian government has done. So we haven't seen famine deaths or hunger deaths happen in the last 50, 60 years on any significant scale, because we are taking care of the fall in entitlements of people. What you are seeing, unfortunately, in places like Kalahandi is immiserization, which is on an everyday basis. People are so much under debt that they are losing their assets, they are losing their entitlements, and they don't have access to the food that they themselves have grown in the lands that they are working on. So, to actually understand this whole population and food story, we need to understand inequality in our society. We need to understand inequality in access to food. In fact, over the last 200 years, the world has been overproducing food. We have too much food. It's just India has been overproducing all of this rice and wheat. It has just not reached the people it is supposed to reach because they don't have the entitlements to purchase that food.
So, any other question, or we would close this session with a vote of thanks to ma'am. It's been really a wonderful session, and we got to know a lot about different aspects of agriculture and the policies and the metrics. You especially talked about what could be some of the interesting metrics in which we can measure how efficient or inefficient we are with our food production systems and basically food miles. I mean, I think that's a really interesting concept which you spoke about, and water intensity for crop and the energy input versus energy output which it is giving. I think yes. I mean, as from management students' point of view, I think you could find out a lot of solutions for the general people, the farmers, etc. Many of you are actually from have a rural connect, so I think it would be a really lecture which can help you later on, either going for a startup or working in a social sector, etc. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for taking time out and addressing our students. In fact, it has been a very wonderful session, insightful session. Thanks a lot again. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been my pleasure. I can put in my email address in the chat if any of you would like to reach out to me
Sure,
later
sure,
on.
ma'am. Sure, ma'am.
And I think Abhishek ji had also shared the report, the State of Rural and Agrarian India Report 2020. If some of you are looking for interesting ideas, then please go through that report, especially the last one third of the report is what my talk today was based on. But that has a lot more details and a lot more ideas for you guys to think about as you think of your startups or whatever else you may be wishing to do in this space. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.